burn my notebook.
Who's to stop me?
A very old and dear companion. Now go.
At a train station in France, a boy named Hugo moves through the walls secretly to maintain the clocks. Hugo has been living there for a while, and he tries to do his job discreetly so that the station inspector won't see him. One day, while moving around, Hugo sees a man named George playing with a mouse toy at his toy booth. Hugo seems interested in checking out the toy, and as George dozes off, he heads toward the shop. Just as he's about to grab the toy, George catches him and calls him a thief.
First time you've stolen from me, is it?
Hugo denies this, but George says he knows that Hugo has been stealing toy parts from his shop. Hugo still insists that he's not a thief, but George tells him to empty his pockets. As Hugo empties one of his pockets, George sees some of the toy parts that were recently stolen from his shop. George seems pissed and tells Hugo to empty his other pocket. Hugo initially seems reluctant, but he eventually brings out a small notebook from his pocket.
Where's the station inspector?
When George opens the notebook, he looks shocked and realizes that it contains several drawings of an automaton. He immediately assumes that Hugo stole the book, but Hugo denies this. He also tries to get his book back, but George refuses to give it up. He insists that he wants to know who drew in the book, but Hugo doesn't respond. As George seems pissed, he threatens to call the station inspector to arrest Hugo if he doesn't leave the shop. Interestingly, the station inspector hears this, and he sends his dog after Hugo.
Malediction!
Before the dog reaches the shop, Hugo runs away and avoids getting caught. After a while, he returns to his room within the walls of the train station and stares at the Eiffel Tower while looking sad. Later that night, while George is closing his shop, Hugo heads back there to ask for his notebook. George tells Hugo to stay away from him, but Hugo refuses to do this because he wants his book back. George threatens to call the station inspector again, but Hugo doesn't seem really bothered.
Children of your own to take things that don't belong to them.
As George then says he'll burn the notebook, Hugo looks shocked and tells him not to do that. George just walks out of the train station without saying anything, and Hugo follows him. When George gets home, he just locks the door and leaves Hugo outside. Hugo looks disappointed, but he suddenly sees a girl named Isabel inside the house. Hugo then throws a stone at her window and signals her to come outside.
I'll make sure he doesn't burn your notebook.
Isabel looks surprised, and when she gets outside, she asks who he is. Hugo says Isabel's grandfather stole his notebook, and he wants it back. Isabel then mentions that George isn't her grandfather, and that he's also not a thief like Hugo. She tells Hugo to leave, but he says he's not going anywhere without his notebook. Isabel looks confused and asks what's so important about it. Hugo says it's a secret, and Isabel tells him to share it with her.
What is it?
It's called an automaton.
Hugo refuses to do this, and he insists on staying outside the house until he gets his book back. Isabel then says she'll try to stop George from burning the notebook, and Hugo decides to head back to the station. When he gets there, he stares at the automaton in his room and looks sad. He then remembers the day his dad brought home the automaton. Hugo looked impressed, and his dad mentioned that he found the automaton abandoned in the attic at the museum where he works.
With David Copperfield. Photography?
He adds that the automaton can actually write, and that such machines were used by magicians in the past for many things. He also showed Hugo the automaton's clockwork, which is the key to making it work. Hugo asks if it can be fixed, and his dad says that even though it will be very hard to find parts that fit, he's sure they'll be able to fix it because they're clockmakers. This gets Hugo excited, and the next day he starts working on the automaton with his dad.
And I've never had one before.
After getting a few parts for it, they soon realize that the machine cannot work without a heart-shaped key. Days later, while Hugo's dad is looking at some machines at the museum, he hears a strange sound in the building. Unfortunately, it turns out that the museum is on fire, and Hugo's dad is unable to get out alive. That night, Hugo's alcoholic uncle, Claude, comes over to inform Hugo about his dad's death. Hugo looks devastated, and Claude tells him to pack his things quickly.
Was that your bottle?
He says that Hugo will now live with him at the train station, where he'll be taught how to take care of the clocks. Hugo looks disappointed but leaves the house with the automaton. When he gets to the station, Claude tells him to get some sleep because he'll start working tomorrow. Hugo asks if he'll still go to school, but Claude says there's no time for that. Hugo doesn't look happy, but Claude mentions that without him, Hugo would be in an orphanage. Hugo doesn't respond to this, and he just walks away.
Yes, officer, another orphan.
A while later, Claude goes missing, and Hugo stays alone inside the walls of the train station. Since Hugo could be sent to an orphanage if the station inspector finds out that Claude is no longer around, he continues maintaining the clocks and finding ways to survive daily. In the present day, Hugo continues staring at the automaton and wonders if he'll ever be able to fix it. The next morning, Hugo steals some food at the train station and quickly runs away before the station inspector can spot him. He then heads to George's shop to ask for his notebook.
I thought I might see you today.
George doesn't look pleased to see Hugo, and he gives him a wrapped cloth containing the ashes of the notebook. Hugo looks devastated, and as George tells him to go away, he does just this. He eventually bumps into Isabel, who sees him crying and consoles him. She also mentions that she has something to tell him, but that they need to go somewhere private. Following this, she takes him to a library, but when they get there, the librarian, Monsieur Labisse, doesn't look happy to see Hugo because everyone knows him to be a thief.
But not here. We're too...
Isabel eventually takes Hugo around and suggests asking Labisse to give Hugo a book. Hugo says he's not interested, and Isabel asks if he doesn't like books. Hugo says he does, and that he used to read books with his dad. He looks sad as he says this, and Isabel feels sorry for him. She then mentions that George didn't actually burn Hugo's notebook, and that the ashes were fake. She adds that the book made George and his wife, John, really sad, and that she thinks she even saw George crying while talking about it.
With your filthy little mitt.
Hugo looks confused, but Isabel tells him to stand up to George if he really wants to get his book back. Later that day, Hugo returns to George's shop to ask for his book again. George tells Hugo to go away, but he refuses. George then asks Hugo to fix his broken toy mouse, and even though Hugo seems reluctant at first, he fixes it. George looks impressed and says he can see that Hugo has real talent. He adds that Hugo will have to earn his book back by working at the shop to repay all the things he stole in the past.
This is the one.
Who's a little strudel thief then?
Hugo asks how long it will take, and George says he'll return the book when he's satisfied with Hugo's work. Hugo says he has another job, but George mentions that stealing isn't a job. Hugo insists that he has another job but won't mind working at George's shop. Following this, he starts working at the shop to fix broken toys. George also happens to be a magician, and he teaches Hugo how to do a few card tricks.
Any time in the last year?
No, I don't think so.
This makes Hugo happy, and he also shows some of the tricks to the automaton. While working at the shop, Hugo is able to get some extra parts for the automaton, but the machine still doesn't work because he hasn't found the heart-shaped key. The next day, Hugo sees the station inspector arresting an orphan and locking him up in a cell for trying to steal someone's food. This makes Hugo sad, and he wonders if he'll be in that position one day. Shortly after, Hugo heads to the library again with Isabel. While looking around, Hugo sees a book titled Robin Hood and tells Isabel that he has seen the movie.
Do you want to have an adventure?
Isabel then says she has never seen a movie because George doesn't allow it. Hugo looks surprised and says that his dad used to take him to see a movie on his birthday. Isabel asks if his dad is dead, but Hugo says he doesn't want to talk about it. He then asks if she would like to go on an adventure with him.
You get into trouble.
Isabel looks excited because she likes adventures, and she agrees to follow Hugo. Just then, they sneak into a cinema to watch a movie. Isabel seems pleased, but the owner of the cinema eventually finds them and throws them out. As they walk away, Hugo asks Isabel why George doesn't let her watch movies. Isabel says George has never given her a reason before, and that she thinks her parents would have allowed her to see different movies. Hugo asks about her parents.
What happened to them?
and Isabelle says they died after she was born. She adds that Georges and Jean are her godparents, and they've been taking care of her since she was a child. She also mentions that they're really nice about everything except movies. Hugo then talks about his dad's love for movies. He says his dad used to talk about the first movie he watched, in which he saw a rocket flying into the eye of a man on the moon. Isabelle finds this funny, and Hugo says movies are really amazing, and that he misses going to them with his dad.
My uncle taught me how to run the clocks.
Isabelle then asks where Hugo lives, and he points at the train station. When they get there, Hugo tells Isabelle about how he has been maintaining the clocks since his uncle disappeared. Isabelle asks if he isn't bothered that someone might find out one day, but he mentions that it's unlikely as long as the clocks keep running. Almost immediately, Hugo sees the station inspector walking toward them, and he tells Isabelle to act natural. The station inspector eventually stops them and asks for their parents. Isabelle then tells him that she lives with George and that Hugo is her cousin.
He's quite simple-minded.
The station inspector suspects that she's lying, and Hugo looks scared. Isabelle manages to get the station inspector to leave them alone, and as he walks away, Hugo looks relieved. She then asks where Hugo lives, but he just walks away because he doesn't want to take her there. As she follows him, she struggles to get past the people walking toward the entrance, and she ends up falling to the ground. She immediately calls Hugo for help, and he heads back to meet her. After helping her up, he sees a heart-shaped key attached to her necklace and looks surprised. He asks where she got it, but she says it's none of his business. Hugo says he needs it, but Isabelle mentions that she won't give it to him unless he tells her why. Following this, Hugo takes her inside the walls and shows her the automaton. Isabelle looks surprised and wonders why her key would fit into Hugo's dad's machine. She then asks what would happen to the automaton when Hugo winds it up. Hugo says he has no idea, and that even though he thinks it's silly, he sometimes thinks his dad left him a message through the machine. Isabelle then gives him the key, and as Hugo inserts it into the machine, it starts writing random things on a piece of paper. Hugo looks confused, and as the machine suddenly stops, he laments about not being able to fix it.
I think it's going to be a message from my father.
As Isabelle tries to console him, the machine suddenly continues working, and the kids realize that it's drawing something on the piece of paper. Surprisingly, the machine ends up drawing the main scene from the first movie that Hugo's dad watched. The machine also writes George's name after finishing up with the drawing, and the kids look surprised. Isabelle asks why Hugo's dad's machine would sign George's name, but Hugo says he doesn't know. However, he mentions that he believes the drawing is a message from his dad. Shortly after, the kids head to George's house and meet Jean, who doesn't look happy to see Hugo because she thinks he's a thief. Hugo says he's not a thief, and Isabelle tries to explain why she came home with him. Before she's done talking, Hugo shows Johnny the drawing, and she looks shocked. The drawing also makes her feel sad, and she asks where Hugo found it. Hugo says a mechanical man drew it, but John still looks confused. Hugo then explains that his dad found the mechanical man at the museum, and they fixed it together. Jean immediately realizes that Hugo was able to operate the automaton using the key she gave to Isabelle. She says Hugo has to leave because she doesn't want George to see the drawing. Hugo then says he's not leaving until he understands what the drawing means, because it's the only thing his dad left him.
Can't dredge up the past now. Whatever happens, you don't let Papa George see it.
Jean says he's too young to understand, and that he shouldn't know such sadness yet. As she opens the door, she notices that George is already in front, and she quickly tells the kids to hide in her room and stay silent. Interestingly, Hugo notices that she looked at the wardrobe strangely, and he decides to check it out. Isabelle also offers to help, and she finds a small box containing some drawings. Unfortunately, she ends up falling down, and the drawings get scattered around the room. George also hears this and enters the room, only to see the kids and the scattered drawings. As he grabs some of the drawings, he says they're back from the dead. The kids don't understand this, and as George nearly destroys the drawings, Jean stops him and reminds him that they're his works. George still seems pissed, and he says he's nothing but a penniless merchant. He also complains that Hugo has betrayed his trust by making him remember the past. As he cries and calls Hugo a cruel boy, Jean consoles him. Hugo feels sad, and as he leaves the house, Isabelle thanks him for taking her to the cinema earlier. The next day, Hugo and Isabelle head to the library to find a book about movies.
Filmmaker George
Many years.
They eventually find one written by a man named Rene, and as they go through it, they see different stories about the first movies ever made. Interestingly, they also see a replica of the automaton's drawing, and they look shocked. As they read further, they realize that George was one of the first filmmakers to realize that films had the power to capture dreams. The book also mentions that George died during the Great War, and the kids look confused. Suddenly, a man appears behind them and asks if they are interested in George's work. Hugo immediately realizes that the man is Rene, and as he informs Isabel, she tells the writer that George is her godfather, and he's very much alive. Rene says it's impossible, but the kids insist that George is alive. Rene asks why he should believe them, and Hugo says it's because they're telling the truth. Rene finds this funny, but he still takes them to his office to show them how much he loves George's work. The kids look amazed when they see old pictures and other things George used to make films in the past.
He was a magician.
Hugo realizes that George was also a popular magician, and Isabel notices that he was very happy in the old pictures. She then asks if Rene would like to meet George, but the writer says he already met his idol many years ago while his dad worked as a carpenter, building sets for George. The kids look amazed when they hear about George's sets, and Isabel asks why her godfather stopped making films. Rene says he has no idea, and that everyone thought he died after the war, just like many others. Hugo asks if they can see some of George's old movies, but Rene says time hasn't been kind to such old films. He adds that he has a copy of the only movie that survived. The kids eventually leave, and Hugo suggests bringing Rene over to show George his old film, so he'd realize that he hasn't been forgotten. Isabel asks if she should tell John, but Hugo says it has to be a surprise. Almost immediately, Hugo drops a screwdriver while working on a clock at the train station, and he looks scared because the station inspector is around.
You can hold on to a bottle well enough, can't you?
The inspector sees the screwdriver and scolds Claude for dropping it because it could have injured someone. The inspector eventually walks away, and Hugo looks relieved because everyone still thinks Claude is maintaining the clocks. Shortly after, Hugo talks about how fixing things might be his purpose because he enjoyed doing it with his dad, but Isabel says she has no idea what hers could be. She adds that she might have known if her parents were alive. Hugo feels sorry for her and tells her that he thinks the world is one big machine where all parts have a purpose. He says he's sure Isabel has a purpose because machines don't usually come with extra parts. Later that night, as Isabel is about to leave, Hugo tells her that he'll be bringing Rene to her house tomorrow night. He also reminds her not to tell Jean and George about the surprise. After this, Hugo returns to his room and has a nightmare in which a train nearly hits him while he's trying to grab the heart-shaped key from the train tracks. He also wakes up from another nightmare in which he sees himself as an automaton. The next day, Claude's dead body is found in a river, and the station inspector is informed about this. As the station inspector learns that Claude has likely been dead for months, he looks shocked and wonders how the clocks have been running in Claude's absence. Later that day, Hugo heads to George's house with Rene. When Jean sees Hugo, she looks pissed
We found out who Papa George is.
and tells Isabel that Hugo is not welcome in the house. Hugo then explains that he and Isabel already know who George is. Isabel confirms this and begs Jean to let Rene show George one of his old films. Jean insists that George is sleeping and he hasn't been feeling well since the other day. Rene then talks about how much he loved George's work and was inspired by them. Jean looks pleased to hear this, but she says she doesn't want to disturb George because he's too fragile, and remembering the past hurts him. As she's about to walk away, Rene says she looks just as lovely as she did in the old movies. Jean appreciates this, and the kids realize that she used to be an actress in the past. Jean says it was a long time ago and that she was a different person. Rene asks if she would like to meet the person again because he came with a film. Jean looks surprised and asks if he really has one of George's films.
We want movie stars like they have today.
Rene confirms this and offers to show it to her, and the kids also beg her to listen to him. Jean then agrees and tells them to stay silent so they won't disturb George. Following this, Rene plays the film, and the kids look amazed. Jean also enjoys seeing herself in the film, and she tells the kids about how each frame was painted by hand to add color. After the movie ends, Isabel says Jean was really really beautiful, and George says she still is. They all look shocked to see him behind them, but he says he heard the sound of the projector. Jean then tells George that trying to forget the past has brought him so much pain, and it's probably time to embrace it. George looks happy and asks if Hugo wants to know his story. Hugo says he does, and George says he liked to fix things just like Hugo. He adds that he started out as a magician while Jean was his assistant. George was really successful as a magician, and he was also good at making machines. He even had his own workshop and built an automaton.
I wrote.
One day, while he was at a circus with Jean, he saw a cinema and went in to watch a short film, which showed just a passing train. This instantly made him interested in motion pictures, and after seeing the machines used at the cinema, he decided to create his own. He and Jean then sold their theater so they could build their own movie studio. They risked everything they had to start making movies, and luckily, things worked out well for them as they were able to produce many imaginary films. Unfortunately, things went south after the war because people were no longer interested in movies, and George couldn't make any money to keep the business running. One night, he burned his old sets and costumes out of anger, and he was also forced to sell his movies to a company that melted them down into chemicals used to make shoe heels. With the money he made from the sale, he bought the toy booth and has been there since. As George continues his narration, he says the only thing he couldn't bring himself to destroy
Into a museum.
was the automaton, and that he donated it to a museum, which eventually burned down. George laments that everything he had is gone, and that one lesson he has learned in life is that happy endings only happen in movies. Almost immediately, Hugo realizes that George's automaton is the same one his dad found at the museum. Since it will be a good surprise for George to see it again, Hugo leaves the house and says he'll be back. When Hugo gets to the station, he sees the inspector and quickly finds a place to hide. While he's there, he hears the station inspector talking about Claude's death. Before Hugo can escape, the station inspector grabs him and threatens to lock him up. Hugo begs the inspector to release him, and some of the traders also try to plead for him. However, the station inspector angrily takes Hugo to his office and says that Hugo has been undermining the station for too long. He says he won't let Hugo go anywhere until his parents have been found.
Has been a busy week.
Hugo says he doesn't have parents anymore, and the station inspector says he'll be sent to the orphanage to learn how to follow orders and survive without a family, just like he did. As the station inspector calls a police officer to come and take another orphan away, Hugo manages to escape from his cell. The station inspector follows him and notices that he's hiding inside the walls of the station. The inspector still goes after Hugo with his dog, but Hugo manages to climb out the window and hide near the clock outside. When the inspector doesn't see Hugo, he eventually leaves with his dog. After this, Hugo goes back inside to grab the automaton. Before he can leave the station, the inspector sees him again. Hugo tries to run away, but as the inspector grabs him, the automaton falls on the train tracks. Hugo looks disappointed and immediately jumps down to grab it. Everyone looks shocked because a train is heading toward him. After Hugo grabs the automaton, he struggles to figure out a way back up, and as he gives up, the station inspector saves him and the automaton. The inspector then scolds Hugo for jumping in front of a train and insists on sending Hugo to the orphanage. Hugo looks disappointed and begs the station inspector to release him, saying he doesn't belong in an orphanage. He says he doesn't understand why his dad died and left him alone. He adds that this is his only chance to work and that he expects the inspector to understand because he recently survived the war and now works with a prosthetic attached to his fractured leg. Before the inspector can say anything, George arrives with Isabel and says he understands. He also tells the inspector that Hugo belongs to him. The inspector feels sorry for Hugo and decides to let him go with George. As Hugo runs to meet George, he says he's sorry because the automaton is broken, but Georges tells him not to worry about it. George then heads home with the kids, and as the station inspector feels sad, his girlfriend comes over to console him. A while later, George is honored at a special ceremony where he's named the newest member of the Film Academy faculty. As George gives a speech, he says he's standing before the audience today thanks to a brave young man who saw a broken machine and fixed it. After this, he showcases some of his old films that have been recovered, and everyone looks impressed. Later that night, George heads home with his family to celebrate his achievement. There, Isabel admires Hugo and decides to write a story about him. After Hugo loses his dad, he moves in with his uncle and continues trying to fix the automaton his dad left behind. Hugo eventually manages to fix it, but he realizes that the machine actually belongs to a man named Georges. Interestingly, Georges happens to be one of the great pioneers of filmmaking, whose career ended sadly after the Great War. Hugo still believes Georges' old works are important, and he teams up with Isabel to make Georges happy again by showing him his old films. This works out quite well, and George is also honored by the Film Academy for his contributions to cinema.